Thank you for coming back in. I was like, I hope I don't chase people away. I did ask them to give me a stool so I wouldn't. Anyway, so I have another presentation, and let's see if I need to, whenever you want to put it up. The idea is that the most common form of government is kings, and democracies and republics are attempts to take the power of the king and give it to the people. And ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and ultimately ancient Israel. And so I spent a couple years researching every civilization that's ever existed on the planet. I guess I have a hard time sleeping, but you have a Nimrod Tower of Babel, and Josephus said Nimrod wanted to build a tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. And so it was defiant against God, and that he made everyone bake bricks and bring him or he would kill them. So it's oppressive over man. And God comes down and confuses the languages and the people scatter. But it's almost like every generation since has tried to rebuild the Tower of Babel. And every time it comes around, it's a little bit worse. Because with military advancements, the king can kill more people. And with technological advancements, the kings can track more people. And, there's Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and Sargon of Akkadian, and 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs, 5,000 years of Chinese emperors. 700 BC, the king of Assyria takes the 10 northern tribes of Israel captive. Then you got Cyrus of Persia, lets the Jews go back and rebuild the temple, but Persia is conquered by Alexander the Great. And he stopped from going into India. Chandragupta, they got the biggest empire. Then the Romans have the biggest empire. Then you got Attila the Hun has the biggest empire. And then Byzantine. And then Islam has the biggest empire. And then Charlemagne has and then the Vikings have the biggest. And they keep getting bigger. Genghis Khan has the biggest empire. And anybody that can do plotting knows that it's going to max out on a global level. Right? And you got Montezuma, and then the King of Spain, King of France, and finally the King of England. Had the largest empire that the planet had ever seen. And so our founders took the power of a king and separated it into three branches, sort of taking the Tower of Babel and scattering it. They took the power of one person ruling and they broke it into three branches. James Madison said, we don't have any angels among us. All we have is selfish human beings. And so the idea is you pit the selfishness in one branch against the other two. And I'm one of 11 kids. So I have 5 brothers and 5 sisters. And I remember growing up, and there was one my brother and I were playing in the backyard. We came in, and there was one brownie left in the pan that my mom had made, brownies. And we were about to fight over it. My mom says, one of you cuts it, and the other gets to pick the first piece. And it was a brilliant, right? So the person cutting it doesn't know which pieces they're going to get, so they want to cut it equal. It works really good, unless you did it with my little brother, because he spit on him and got both pieces. Of course, I punched him. But imagine a big brownie and 3 hungry boys. You give them each a job. The first one's job is to trace out on the brownie where it's going to be cut. He doesn't know which piece he's going to get, so he's going to try to trace those lines exactly what? Equal. Second one's job is to take the knife and cut it and execute it, right? And enact it into law. And he doesn't know which piece he's going to get, so he's going to try to cut them exactly equal. And the third one's job is to judge and see who gets which piece. So you have the legislative branch laying out the law, the executive branch signing it, enacting it into law, and the judicial branch judging the law. It's a stroke of genius, right? It's like a Sunday school teacher giving an assignment. Design a system of government where sinners keep other sinners from sinning. That's what our Constitution is. Selfish, greedy people keeping other selfish, greedy people from becoming selfish and greedy. It's a 3-way tug-of-war. And so we took the power of the king, separated it into 3 branches, pitted them against each other. Then we separated power again from the federal to the state level. And then they tied up this federal Frankenstein with 10 handcuffs we call the first 10 amendments, right? Limits, there's a preamble to the Bill of Rights. It says, at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, several states were concerned of an abuse of power of the federal government. So certain restrictive clauses will be put on the federal government, right? They're handcuffs placed on the federal government by the states. So in a sense, all the Constitution is simply a way to prevent a president from ruling through mandates and executive orders. Right? So whenever you hear the presidential mandate, that's exactly what our Constitution is designed to prevent. One person rule. And so democracies and republics are taking the power of the king, giving it to the people. What's the difference? Demos means people, kratia means rule. So in a democracy, the people rule. And in Athens, they had 6,000 citizens, and every citizen had to be at every meeting every day to talk about every issue. Totally time-consuming. You had no time for anything else, and it was just living gossip every day. What are we talking about today? And if you weren't keeping up with what they're talking about, you're called an idiotus, an idiot. A republic is where you take care of your family and your farm, and you have someone in your place that goes to the market every day. They are your representative. So you can do other things. And republics could get bigger because you don't have to be there every day. And so it's easy to remember the REP in the word republic is the REP in the word representative. Republican form of government is a representative form of, but either way, you ruling directly being there or you ruling directly through a representative, democracies and republics is where the people are the king. Take the power of the king and you give it to the people. But what if the king wants the power back? Does he just go to the people and say, hi, I want to be king. Give me control of your life. Oh, okay, yeah, here you go. Is that how it works? No, so there's two ways in which the king can take the power away from the people. Fear. When people get afraid, they will trade freedom for security. Yeah. And the other is free stuff. The king's so nice, he gives you free stuff until you get dependent. And then you want to continue the free stuff, you'll incrementally give up your freedom. It's like a drug dealer takes over a neighborhood two ways. He can come in with guns and get everybody in fear. And they submit to the mob just to be left alone, and they'll pay protection money. Or the drug dealer's so nice, he's giving away free drugs until you get hooked. And then you want some more free drugs, you're going to sell yourself into prostitution. You're going to rob from your day. You're going to give up freedom over your life. It's like a hunter catches animals through guns or bait. Right? There's the gun, right? Or there's bait. You're trapped. And so these scriptures are, fear of man bringeth a snare. Snare is a trap. When you feel yourself getting into fear, you're about to be trapped. And that's why the Bible says, fear not, fear not, fear not. Only believe, do not tremble nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you. He'll subdue your enemies. And so God says, walk in faith, don't get into fear. And the other is free stuff. James 1:15, but every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Right? So you can get trapped. And so those are the two ways in which people will give up their freedom back to a king. Fear and free stuff. So it developed methods of creating fear. So how do you create fear? Discord. When there's unity, there's peace. But when there's discord, that's when you got conflict, and that's when you got fear. And so scriptures, Psalms 133, how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Everybody say unity. And then Proverbs 6 things the Lord hate, he that soweth discord. Everybody, discord. So we got unity, we got discord. Imagine being in heaven and somebody sowing discord in heaven. Well, it happened. Lucifer. And there's only one will in heaven. It is God's will. It is a good will. He created you out of nothing. He loves you and he wants to spend eternity with you. It's a good will. And for there to be peace in heaven, there can only be one will. When Satan said, I will be like the Most High. I will put my throne above the throne of God. I will, I will, I will. 5 times he says, I will. Yep. We got 2 wills going on. And they're not the same will. And so there's conflict. There's war in heaven. And he's cast out. And the word devil in Greek is diabolos, which means to divide, to sow discord. And so he goes into the garden, and Satan sows discord. He gets Adam to blame Eve. He sows discord and gets Cain to kill Abel. And then that first 400 years out of Egypt, before Israel has a king, it's called the Hebrew Republic. And Gideon just defeated 100,000 Midianites. There is nobody threatening to attack Israel anytime soon. They just defeated 100,000. And so Israel is at peace. But Gideon has an illegitimate son named Abimelech, and he wants power, and so he sows discord. He goes to the city of Shechem, and he does critical race theory, identity race politics. What does he do? Is it better for you that all the sons of Gideon reign over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. Right? So instead of I can do a better job. It's no, I'm one of you. Relate to me on my flesh level, right? And his brethren spake of him in the ears of all the men at Shechem when their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. And then they go to the city treasury and they take money to hire protesters, rioters, Antifa, BLM type people, right? And what do? They commit violence. And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal-berith, wherewith Abimelech hired vain and worthless persons which followed him. And they went into his father's house at Ophrah, and they did violence. They slew his brethren. And then the men of Shechem made Abimelech king. So you have a country that's completely at peace. And on the inside, you have somebody sowing division based on race, and then taking money and hiring rioters to commit violence. And when there's enough chaos, then he usurps power and he's king. And now the Hebrew Republic would have ended here rather than a century later with King Saul, had not somebody threw a millstone over the wall and it killed Abimelech. Well, let's fast forward to Italy, 500 years ago. A bunch of city-states, Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena, they all had armies and fought. And Machiavelli thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end, because it'll stop all the infighting, that any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal. So if a prince conquers a city, and the city does not want to be conquered, they would hate him. But if the prince pays criminals, like Abimelech did, to kill cows, create violence, set things on fire, the people will panic and want someone to come in and restore order, and the prince will come in and get rid of the very criminals he bribed to create the crises. Nobody will know the better for it, and everyone will praise the prince as a hero. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house, set it on fire, then you go around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher. And they'll pay anything for it and even thank you for being there. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. And you know that quote a little more recently with Rahm Emanuel. And he said, you don't ever want a crisis to go to waste. It's an opportunity to do important things you would otherwise avoid. Fox News, primetime, Ben Domenech, Rahm Emanuel's famous dictum, never let a crisis go to waste. Normal times don't produce the outcomes that the authoritarian left wants because people are not scared enough to give them the limitless power they crave. Crises are necessary. And so if there aren't any on offer, they manufacture them. So if there's unity, nobody's going to want to give up their freedom. But if you get it so discord and get them into fear, and then they panic and there's a crisis, they'll say, okay, take my freedom, just restore order. And so they need to create crises, create or capitalize on a crisis. So you and I see a crisis, our response is how can we help people through it? They see a crisis, their response is how can we usurp power through it? Imprimis magazine, Michael Rechtenwald wrote in an article, The Great Reset, Klaus Schwab and Thierry Mallard write that if the past 5 centuries in Europe and America have taught us anything, it's that acute crises contribute to boosting the power of the state. And so this is called the Great Reset, where they're planning acute crises so they can boost their global government. Henry Louis Mencken wrote, the urge to save humanity is almost always only a false face for the urge to rule it. Climate crisis, this crisis, that crisis. Even Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, this is just recently, this is November of 22, he's at Stanford giving a lecture. And he says, the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age, on the other side is, we're not going to make it for another century on this planet, and therefore we need to embrace a one-world totalitarian state right now. Whatever the dangers are in the future, we need to never underestimate the danger of one world totalitarian state. And he ends his talk with a scripture. 1 Thessalonians 5:3, the political slogan of the Antichrist is peace and safety. And then at the end he says, I want to suggest that we would do well to be a little more scared of the Antichrist and a little less scared of Armageddon. Yeah. What's he talking about? Instead of, oh, the world's going to end, we need somebody to save us. He says, you need to be afraid of that guy that promises to save you from Armageddon. He's worse, right? That's the Antichrist. But I thought here, it's interesting, the founder of PayPal, I mean, he's not known for quoting scriptures, and here he is saying, watch out for these people, these globalists that want to save you from this world crisis. And then, of course, Elon Musk. The World Economic Forum is increasingly becoming an unelected world government that the people never ask for and don't want. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the American press makes its annual pilgrimage to genuflect to Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab to get its marching orders from the billionaires. And so we're talking sowing discord. Lucifer sows discord in heaven, and then sows discord in the garden. Adam, blame and Eve, Cain, kill, and Abel. Sows discord with Abimelech, sowing discord right in the critical race theory with Shechem and in Israel. Machiavelli, sowing discord, getting these, creating the crises so that these city-states will want somebody to come in and restore order, but they usurp power. Well, the British Empire became the biggest empire on planet Earth. How did they get so big? You think they just walked into a country and said, hi, we want to be the biggest empire on earth, so give us control of your country. Okay, yeah, we've been waiting for you. Here you go. Is that how it happened? Let's look at how the British took over India. In 1714, they land in Bengal and open a trading post that turns into a trading fort that turned into them having guns and giving guns to one kingdom and giving guns to another kingdom and then stirring up discord between the kingdoms. Ancient animosities until they start fighting and killing each other. And when they weaken each other really good, then the British come in and take over both kingdoms. And they do this again and again and again until they took over all of India. A quarter of the world's population. They did it in Africa. I was talking to Bishop Lawari in Uganda. There's 56 tribes in Uganda. And they would come in and they would find some that they could classify as victims, others as oppressors, and they'd pit them against each other and fight and say, oh, we'll help you against the other one. But then when they got them all to fight, they could conquer the whole country and make it a colony. And they tried doing it in America during the Revolutionary War. The British came down from Canada and made a treaty with the Mohawk Indians, promising them money for scalps. So the Indians and the Americans had sort of reached an equilibrium when they were getting along. And the British come into the Indians and say, look, we'll give you money for scalps. And so they would scalp the Americans. They wanted to stir up this division, sow animosity, sow discord. And it was so bad it got listed in our Declaration of Independence as one of the reasons we were rebelling against King George. Right? We're all familiar with all men are created equal and endowed by their creator certain inalienable rights, and we're all familiar with that part. But if you read down, there's like 27 reasons, examples of the king violating his God-given responsibility to take care of us, and instead he's attacking us. And it lists this one. It says, the king has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. All right, the Indians do on and off. They're at peace, they're at peace. When they're at war, it's total war. And the British would come in and get them to switch on. And then they did it again during the War of 1812. The British controlled Pensacola, Florida, and just north is Alabama and Fort Mims. And the Indians go to the Red Stick Creek Indians. You know the French pronunciation of Red Stick? Baton Rouge, like Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And so the British go to the Red Stick Indians and promise them money for scalps. And so they capture Fort Mims, Alabama, and they capture 500 prisoners. And what do? They scalp them all. And this is the historical marker. Fort Mims here in Creek Indian War, 1813-14, took place, most brutal massacre in American history. Indians took the fort with heavy loss, then killed all but about 36 of the some 550 in the fort. Creeks had been armed by British at Pensacola in this phase of the War of 1812. Do we really think the British cared about the Red Stick Creek Indians? No, they wanted to stir animosity to fight each other so they could take over both. So we got Lucifer sowing discord in heaven and sowing discord in the garden, you know, Cain, kill, and Abel, and sowing discord with Abimelech. And then we have Machiavelli sowing discord. And then we have the British Empire sowing discord. And then we have the German, Karl Marx. And he is a student at the University of Berlin, and his professor is Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Isn't he handsome? And anyway, so it's called the Young Hegelian Club. And Hegel even influenced Charles Darwin. And so Hegel had taken this idea of going in and sowing discord. He made it into a nice, clean equation, right? Like a triangle. One corner is a thesis, the opposite corner is an antithesis or antithesis, and the top corner is a synthesis. It sounds complicated, but it's not. So Karl Marx says, okay, the thesis is the status quo. It's how people have been getting along for a long time. You have to create discord. You have to get them to not get along. And you have to go in and create a problem that is really bad so everybody panics in fear. And then they'll be willing to give up some of their freedoms to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. And then that becomes the new starting point, and they create another problem that's real bad, and there's discord, and everybody panics in fear and surrenders some more of their freedom to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. And then they create another problem that's real bad, and everybody panics in fear and gives up some more of their freedom to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. And every time they settle, they're giving up their individual freedom to the state. And so it's this intentional creating of crises. And so he said, how do you create a problem that's real bad? You send in agitators, agent provocateurs, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job, find people with grievances and stir them up to riot. And when there's rioting and bloodshed and smashing windows and setting things on fire, like Abimelech paid those vain and worthless persons, right? Machiavelli paying those people to commit the violence. So they get these people to commit the violence, and then when everybody panics in fear because of the discord, they're willing and thankful for somebody to come in and restore order, but they have half the freedoms they had before it all started. And so Karl Marx called it critical theory. So you go into a country and spend a little time observing it and classifying all the groups in the country, economically, religiously, ethnically, and you find out which ones could be portrayed as the victims and which ones could be portrayed as the oppressors, and you stir them up to protest and riot and commit violence. And when everybody panics in fear because of the discord, they beg someone to come in and restore order, and that's when they put in their Soviet leader. And so they would first organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, or the working class against the business owners. And then they would organize the poor against the rich, the blacks against the whites, the Catholics against the Protestants, the Muslims against the Christians. They even organized the Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo and Rwanda. So the Congo and Rwanda, everybody saw themselves as one. But the Belgian and German colonizers came in and measured them and their features and would tell some, you're a Hutu, and the others, you're a Tutsi. They would even make them register as Hutus and Tutsis. So they began to identify with these groups. And then they began to pit the groups against each other. They would fight each other and genocide each other. And then in the killing and the confusion and the mayhem, they would all want someone to restore order. And that's when the colonizing power could come in and take over the whole country. And sort of interesting, Patrice Cullors, co-founder of Black Lives Matter, said, we are trained Marxists. And so Castro, a Marxist, he said the revolutionary needs the enemy. The revolutionary needs his antithesis, which is the counter-revolutionary. And if enemies were lacking, they had to be fabricated. So you have to get people into fear and get them to have an enemy that they can be afraid of, so they'll want to give up some of their freedom so that you can save them from that enemy. And if there aren't any enemies, the people aren't going to be afraid of anything, and so you can't talk them into giving up their freedom. So you have to create an enemy. You have to create a boogeyman. Right? And if enemies are lacking, you just create them out of nothing, like a white supremacist, like a pro-life person, or a pro-life Catholic, or a Second Amendment person. I mean, you create people that aren't enemies, but you make them into enemies, so that you can mobilize the country into fear and panic, so that you use it as an excuse to take away the freedoms of the country. And so Jesus talked about this tactic. He said, if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. So you have a kingdom, And if you sow division inside of it, then it weakens it and you can conquer it. Lincoln said the same thing in his A House Divided speech. A house divided against itself cannot stand. What is it? It's introducing an autoimmune disease into the body politic. What's an autoimmune disease? It's where your own immune system starts attacking your own organs. You have a war going on inside of your own body. And so we have the body politic. They want to insert a war and get the body politic to start fighting each other within the own country. And so critical race theory, patriotism is the enemy. You want to get people to identify with subgroups and then pit the subgroups against each other to create this internal division. And then when everybody panics because of the discord, that's when you usurp power. Franklin Roosevelt, November 1st, 1940. Whoever seeks to set one nationality against another seeks to degrade all nationalities. Whoever seeks to set one race against another seeks to enslave all races. So-called racial voting blocks are the creation of designing politicians who profess to be able to deliver them on election day. Right? You want to get people to identify with these racial voting blocks. You want to pit them into these groups. Rather than identifying as Americans, you get them to identify with these subgroups. And January 2nd, 1942, Franklin Roosevelt, remember the Nazi technique, pit race against race, religion against religion, prejudice against prejudice, divide and conquer. I thought it was interesting. NBA Charles Barkley, CBS Sports Panel, April 3rd, 2021. He said, man, I think most white people and black people are great people. I really believe that in my heart. But I think our system is set up where our politicians, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, are designed to make us not like each other so they can keep their grasp of money and power. They divide and conquer. We're so stupid following our politicians. Now, you got some good ones here, but their only job is, hey, let's make the whites and blacks not like each other. Let's make the rich people and the poor people not like each other. Let's scramble the middle class. I truly believe that in my heart. So breaking people into groups and pitting them against each other was the strategy of Saul Alinsky. He rode around with Al Capone's hitman, Frank Nitti, in Chicago, and saw that all he had to do was kill a few people, smash a few windows, and everybody in the neighborhood would panic in fear and submit to the mob and pay extortion protection money. He goes, let's just apply this to politics. Create a problem that's real bad and get everybody to panic in fear, and they'll give up their freedoms to settle for a political answer. So he writes a book called Rules for Radicals, and he influences American politics. Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis at Wellesley College on Saul Alinsky. And former President Obama was an Alinsky organizer there in Chicago. And Alinsky said the first step in community organization is community disorganization. Disruption of the present organization is the first step. The organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent. Fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. The organizer polarizes the issue and helps lead his forces into conflict. He must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. So this is the politics we've been having in America. The intentional breaking people into groups and pitting them against each other to create crises, to get everybody to panic and give up their freedoms. And in the front of his book, he has an acknowledgement to Lucifer. Right? We started off with Lucifer sowing discord in heaven, and he even lists. He says, lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. How do you destroy a marriage? Sow discord. How do you destroy a family? Sow discord. How do you destroy a church? Sow discord. How do you destroy a country? Sow discord. Now, one of the tactics that fits in with this is you literally sow discord with violence. And there's something called false flags, and it goes back to pirates. 2 days ago I spoke in Beaufort, North Carolina, and that's where Blackbeard was. And the couple that drove me around, he runs the museums regarding Blackbeard. He's like the #1 authority in the world on Blackbeard, and the Queen Anne's Revenge was the name of his boat and everything. Anyway, so he said that the pirates really didn't want to actually kill people, because if they got into the fight, that their ship could be damaged, the prize ship that they're wanting to capture could be damaged, you know, and they didn't have access to hospitals. And so their tactic was to surprise the enemy and shock them into surrendering, sort of a shock and awe type of thing. And so what they would do is they would raise a false flag, like a distress signal flag or the flag of a friendly nation, and they would lure a unsuspecting boat to get close. And when the unsuspecting boat got close enough, and suddenly they would realize that it's not a distressed vessel and it's not a friendly vessel, they would take down the friendly flag and they would put up their pirate flag, and they would have knives in their teeth, they'd have their pistols, and Blackbeard had this big bushy hair, this big bushy beard, and he was like 6'9". He was like really big, and he would take the wicks that they would use for the cannons, and he would light them on fire and stick them in his beard and in his hair, so he was like a smoking demon. And these guys would jump onto the board of the ship that they were capturing, and everybody would like panic, and they'd be like, okay, here, take my money, take my gold. And so it's called a false flag, where you want to shock people into fear so they will, boom, just collapse and surrender. And so this concept got put into politics. And so this would be this intentional creating of terror to get people to submit. And Robespierre, during the French Revolution, actually planned terrorist attacks against his own French population so that they would panic and surrender to this new secular order. And here's one, King of Sweden. Sweden used to be a global power. In the 1600s, it was huge. It controlled parts of Northern Europe and Estonia and Latvia and parts of Russia. And it was the Jan Sobieski, the Polish, you know, they have all these different leaders. And then the Swedes founded Delaware, New Jersey. That used to be New Sweden. And then it got taken over by the Dutch and taken over by the British, and they turned it into Delaware, New Jersey. But the Swedes had this enormous power. And then in the 1700s, Russia was encroaching on some of Sweden's domain. And so there was a king of Sweden named Gustav III, and he wanted to fight Russia, but his parliament would not approve the funding. And so in 1788, he had the tailor of the Royal Swedish Opera sew some Russian uniforms, and had some Swedish soldiers put them on and stage an attack at a Swedish outpost at Pumala. And the news just spread like wildfire across the country that the Russians had attacked, and Parliament quickly approved the funding for the war. And anyway, that's similar to what's called the Gleiwitz incident. And so the Nazis wanted to invade Poland, but world public opinion wouldn't go along with it. And so the Nazis had soldiers dress up in Polish uniforms and attack an outpost where there was a radio tower. And while they're attacking, the radio is announcing, the Polish had attacked, the Polish are killing, the Polish are doing this, that, and the other. And it's going all across Germany and all across the world that the Polish had attacked the Germans, and the Germans were now justified in retaliating and going into Poland and taking it over. And this happened again with the Winter War. So the Soviets, 1939, wanted to invade Finland, but world public opinion wouldn't go along with it. And so the Soviets shelled one of their own Russian villages near the Finnish border. And they get on the media and they blame Finland for shelling the village. And it goes around and gets reported in the news that the Finns had attacked the Russians, and that gave them an excuse of invading Finland during the Winter War. And it happened again in China. So China had allowed, Japan was imperialistic, and it was conquering all this area of South Pacific, and they were able to get a little railroad on the coastal area of China. And they claimed that their railroad had an explosion, and they blamed the Chinese for the explosion. at Mukden. And so the Japanese come in and they invade and kill hundreds of thousands of Chinese in Nanking, China. And later there was an international investigation and they walked the entire length of the railroad. And they couldn't find an explosion. There was like one place where there was a spike that was halfway out of the ground. They go, well, there was no explosion. They faked it, but they reported it in the news, and it spread, and it gave them an excuse to go in and conquer Nanking, China. Turkey did a similar thing. Istanbul used to be Constantinople, and it was the largest Christian city in the world for 1,000 years, Greek Orthodox. And but then Sultan, Mehmed II took it over in 1453 or whatever, and then after World War I, the Ottoman Empire's gone, the Caliphate's gone, and Turkey has a secular leader named Ataturk, and he distances the country from the fundamental Islam. But in 1955, you have a Turkish leader, Menderes, that wants to get back to fundamentalism. And he wants to get rid of this remnant Greek population in Istanbul. And so the plan was that a Turkish university student would put a bomb in the Turkish consulate that's over in Greece, and Ataturk's birthplace, which was over in Greece, and blow it up and blame the Greeks for blowing it up, and then stirring up the people in Istanbul against the Greek population. The bombs never went off. But the newspapers ran with the story anyway. Right? A bomb went off and blew it up, and it whipped the population into a frenzy, and they attacked the Greek Orthodox neighborhoods, and they destroyed the stores, they destroyed the churches, they destroyed it, smashed it, and they chased the remnant Greek population out of Istanbul. And Erdogan did a similar thing just recently. He ran for office as a moderate, as a secular leader. And once he gets in, he's trying to turn Turkey into a fundamentalist Islamic state. And there's a bunch of people in Turkey that don't want to be a fundamentalist Islamic state. And he realizes that there's this anti-Erdogan movement growing. And so he decides to stage a coup against himself. Here's one of his quotes. "Democracy is like a train," said Mr. Erdogan once. "You get off once you reach your destination." So you get democratically elected, but then you throw democracy out the window and you rule as a dictator. And so he stages this coup. He claims that people were after him, gets in an airplane, flies in a circle and lands, and he pulls out a list of 30,000 of his political opponents and has them zip-tied, taken away, and they've not been seen since. And he just eliminated all of his political opponents. And Stalin did another similar thing. He has a growing anti-Stalinist movement against him in 1934. At the same time, he has a supporter named Sergei Kirov, who's praising Stalin as this wonderful leader. But Sergei Kirov is getting a little too popular. And so Stalin has an idea. He would assassinate his friend and supporter, Sergei Kirov. Nobody would suspect that he did it because they were such good buddies. And he would blame the anti-Stalinists for doing it, and everybody would believe it because the anti-Stalinists did not like Stalin and they did not like Sergei Kirov. And so Stalin used that as an excuse to set up committees, to have hearings, to do investigations, to detain people, to arrest people, and to kill over 1 million people in the First Great Purge in 1936 to 38. Hitler did a similar thing. So Germany was a republic after World War I called the Weimar Republic. People voted for their leaders, and there's a party called the National Socialist Workers' Party, or Nazi, and the head of it is Hitler. And he has an under-the-table violent group, and they are called brown shirts. They're nicknamed Sturmabteilung, which means stormtroopers. And they would be like Abimelech's paid, vain, and worthless persons that would commit violence. They would be like Machiavelli's people that he paid to commit the violence. And so these stormtroopers would storm into the meetings of Hitler's opponents and disrupt the meeting. And then they would lock arms and block access to public buildings. Could you imagine people locking arms in public and blocking things? And then they went into the cities, they blocked streets. And then they went in and they smashed windows downtown. They went into the big cities and smashed over 7,500 stores owned by Jews in the night of broken glass. And then, did I mention that their capital got set on fire? An insurrection, an attack at the Capitol, and evidence points to Hitler's own people setting the fire. But Hitler, in this mass confusion, blamed his political opponents and decided that he was going to have some hearings, going to have some investigations, was going to question people and detain people. And then he had them shot without a trial. And when the dust settled, Hitler didn't have any political opponents left. And so you stage an attack against yourself and use it as an excuse to get rid of your political opponents. Saul Alinsky, in his book, Let Them Call Me Rebel, talks about college students in the 1960s and 70s sought out Alinsky's advice for tactics and strategies. One such occasion in the spring of '72, Tulane University's annual week-long series of events featured leading public figures. Students asked Alinsky for help to plan a protest of a scheduled speech by George H.W. Bush, then U.S. Representative to the United Nations, and the speech was likely to include the defense of Nixon's policies of the Vietnam War. And the students asked Alinsky, they said, we're thinking about protesting. And Alinsky told them that they were wrong in their approach. He told them that they should instead go to hear the speech dressed as members of the Ku Klux Klan. And whenever Bush said anything in defense of the Vietnam War, they should cheer and wave placards reading the KKK supports Bush. And that's what the students did with very successful results. So you infiltrate your opponent's rally, posing as foe supporters. But your goal is to disrupt it and turn the whole thing against the very person that you're supposedly at the rally for. And Tucker Carlson aired this video of the very first people in the U.S. Capitol to bust in.
I want you to pay attention to the first group of assailants as they break into the building. The second man through the window is wearing full tactical body armor and is carrying a baseball bat.
So there really weren't anybody at the rally dressed in black, wearing technical gear. It wasn't like these were, people that went to hear Trump give a speech and then they got riled up by the speech and they decided that they were going to break into the Capitol. It sort of looks pre-planned. And then you have Tucker Carlson talking about there were FBI operatives in the crowd. And then another article, 20 federal assets embedded at the Capitol, court filing says. And then another bombshell, a guy named Ray Epps is on the video, lots of people with their cameras, and the night before he's talking about, we got to break into the Capitol, And ironically, the FBI chooses that they don't want to question him. It's like, what? And then you see they have these very heavy metal doors at the Capitol with magnets. They are bulletproof doors. I mean, they are tank resistant. They're very heavy. There's no way you can break in. You have to be buzzed in from the inside. And then you have even Newt Gingrich. Pelosi is the person who's most responsible for January 6th. Why? Because she somehow, for some reason, turned down Trump's offer to have National Guard security that day. And Gateway Pundit, it was a setup. FBI admits January 6th was a deep state operation. They were running at least one operative in the crowd. And then another January 6th undercover law enforcement officer passed out weapons to January 6th protesters who were later entrapped. Clear entrapment. And then you have Todd Starnes. I was on his program. But here's one of his articles. Tons of FBI informants involved in January 6th, says New York Times reporter Matthew Rosenberg. He says, hidden video reportedly captures New York Times reporter calling coverage of January 6th overblown, fake trauma, fake news, full of FBI informants. They all lied. We have proof. Highly sensitive Department of Justice January 6th document leaks to the Gateway Pundit. And anyway. Even Victor David Hanson, a historian. I like him. He's really good. And he said, why did the committee not investigate whether large numbers of FBI agents and informants were ubiquitous in the crowd? He says a real committee would have investigated other far larger and more lethal riots on iconic federal property months earlier. So you had riots in over 60 cities where they really were destroying public buildings. And they just didn't want to have an interest in those. And it becomes really clear that it looks like they simply paid their Antifa BLM people to put on Trump t-shirts and commit the violence so they could blame Trump. Now, after the Mar-a-Lago raid, Senator Marco Rubio was on Fox News. He says, this is shocking, but in Latin America and in many other countries of the world, here's what happens. A group takes power. One of the first things is they begin to persecute and go after their political opponents. When the supporters of their political opponents begin to complain, they begin to target and criminalize opposition. The next thing you're going to see, because it's the playbook, is going to be that the people who are supporters of Donald Trump or just conservatives are going to begin to be labeled as potential insurrectionists and harassed by law enforcement. So I just thought I'd come give you a little encouragement tonight, you know, and Jay, you can do this, you know. You know, I like to have a little bit. By the way, I'm thinking, since I have a little more time, if you could click up the number 3, the Socialism number 3 file folder. And now I throw in a little bit of an encouragement, not much, but a little bit. You have ancient Israel, and they have a wicked, wicked King Manasseh, and he's sacrificing kids to Moloch. And the prophets come to him and says, you are doing the same thing that the Canaanites did before Israel came in. And there's nothing more unjust than killing an innocent baby that didn't do anything wrong. And because they were doing an unjust stuff, and I'm a just God, I judge them by bringing in Israel to drive the Canaanites out. And now because you're killing innocent babies, I'm going to drive you out. Judgment was pronounced. But then King Manasseh has a grandson named Josiah. He's 6 years old when he becomes king. And then he, or 8 years old. And then when he's a teenager, he starts to seek the Lord. And when he's around 20, he tells him to clean out the temple that his granddad had trashed. And they find the law of God. Josephus said it was the last copy of the law on planet Earth because Manasseh was not just killing babies, he was destroying the law. He cut off the legs of the altar and moved it over for divination. You know, that's when you cut open an animal and look at its gizzards and try to predict the future. I mean, all kinds of weird stuff. And so this young King Josiah tells him to clean out the temple. They found the original copy, supposedly, of Moses that was wrapped in burlap and buried under a bunch of stuff in a storage room. It's the law of God. The priests read it, and they mustn't have read it before because they said, this is pretty serious. And so they decide they're going to take it to this young king. He had obviously never read it before. They read it to the king, and the king says, we are set for judgment, dear God. So what does he do? He sends some messengers to a prophetess in town named Huldah. She's the wife of the king's tailor. And to ask her what's going to happen. And she says, tell the man that sent you, that the king, tell the man that sent you that judgment will come. But not during his lifetime, because he repented when he heard the words of the Lord. And so Josiah has this enormous Passover, supposedly the biggest one ever. He tears down pagan temples. He even tears down pagan temples that Solomon built. Here is Solomon who built the temple and turned around and had a bunch of pagan wives. He married 1,000 wives, and he built pagan temples for his wives. And so there were pagan temples in Jerusalem from the time of Solomon up until this young King Josiah in his 20s, and he says, tear them down. And he tears down the Sodomite temples, and he takes the bones of their pagan priests and he burns them on the altar to defile their altar. And then he sends the Levites out to teach the law. And the Levites go all across Judah, and they're teaching the law. Supposedly during that revival is when Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got saved, right? To use that terminology. And so this was this reprieve. So for the entire 31-year reign of Josiah, there's peace and prosperity in Judah. The judgment was pronounced, but it was put off. And so I'm praying for a Josiah generation. We deserve judgment. But if we rend our hearts and repent and say, God, we want to turn things around, he's going to say, okay, I can put it off. I think it's one of the reasons why we just can't nail down when Jesus is going to come back, because maybe he's giving himself a little leeway, you know. People say, what do you think God's going to do? I thought, you know, maybe he's looking at us to decide what he's going to do. You read through Jeremiah. I've been reading through or listening through Jeremiah on my phone. And in one of the spots, God tells him, you've been defiling the Sabbath. You've been doing business on my Sabbath and bringing stuff in Jerusalem and selling it. And he says, if you return to honoring the Sabbath, Jerusalem will last forever. If you don't and continue to defile the Sabbath, Jerusalem's going to be burnt to the ground. It's almost like, okay, here's the choice. And then he tells later King Zedekiah. He says, if you go out and surrender to the king of Babylon, Jerusalem will be spared. If you don't surrender to the king of Babylon, Jerusalem will be destroyed. And you'll have your eyes burned out and your kids will be killed. And so people say, God knows the future. And one thought is, yeah, he doesn't just know the future, he knows all the possible futures. And he tells you what they are. And he lets you choose. Right? Deuteronomy 28. If you hearken to the voice of the Lord, you will be blessed. You'll be the head and not the tail, above and not beneath. Blessed coming in, blessed coming out, blessed in the field. If you don't hearken to the voice of the Lord, then the enemy will come in amongst you and rise up above you, and they'll be the head and you'll be the tail, and all the diseases of Egypt will come upon you, and it'll get worse and worse and worse. Right? So it's like, here's the two different futures, and you choose. Now, God created light, so he's faster than light. And Einstein's theory of relativity is the closer you can travel approaching the speed of light, for you, time slows down. And since God created light, he's faster than light, so for God, time effectively stands still. We'll never understand that, but there is a verse in the Bible that says a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. So in other words, we're moving in ultra slow motion compared to God. God exists in the ever-present now. I am that I am. When you are in the presence of God, you cannot think of the future and you cannot think of the past. All you think is, I'm in the presence of the creator of the universe. Right? It's awesomeness. It's all now. So for God to create our reality, he had to create this little space-time bubble where everything moves in slow motion compared to him. Now, why is that important? Because we get to make our little free will decisions. But he can recalculate every atom in the universe before it goes to the next frame so that his will is going to take place. So it's our little free will inside the context of his sovereign will, because he's outside of time. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, that's okay. It's one of those things I think about when I'm not sure what I'm thinking about. And anyway, so one of the things with socialism is it's a group thing versus an individual. Judeo-Christian Western civilization is based on the individual. You have a worth because you are made in the image of God, irregardless of what group you belong to. All the other rest of the world, it's called an honor-shame culture. Your worth goes up if the group honors you, and your worth goes down if the group shames you. In Islam, they call it the ummah, the community. And if your daughter embarrasses you in front of your community, they'll even murder their own daughter. And so it's identifying with the group, but the Judeo-Christian concept is you have a worth because you're made in the image of God, irregardless of what group. And anyway, so the battle is for your mind. And so this is an interesting part of my talk in the book I wrote on socialism. The battle for the mind. So we have the 12 Hebrew spies going to the promised land, and they come back, and 10 of them bring an evil report. And they sow fear and discord and panic. And number 13. But the 10 spies who've gone up said, we are not able to go against the people because they're too strong for us. They brought a bad report. The land through which we had gone through and spied us devours its inhabitants. And all the people saw that they were a great statue. We were like grasshoppers. Then all the congregation raised their voices and cried out, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. Caleb quieted the people. We should go by all means and take possession of it, and we will certainly prevail over it. Joshua, Caleb tore their clothes, and they spoke to God, do not rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people of the land, for they will be our prey. Their protection is gone from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. You had 10 people get the entire nation, and they were defeated in their mind before they ever got to the battlefield. And God was so mad at those 10 spies that he immediately struck them dead. And he said, okay, everybody, you're going to wander for 40 years. None of you are going to get to go in except Joshua and Caleb. They lost because they caved to that shock and awe, that false flag, that fear that just overcame them. Whenever you have an overwhelming fear that comes at you, a medical report, threat of a lawsuit, debt, discouragement, divorce, depression, it's this overwhelming, Don't react in fear. Stay in faith. And you make it through the next breath. And you make it through the next breath. Then you make it through the day. Then you make it through 2 days. And you make it through, then you make it through a week. Then you make it through a month. And then finally, a year later, you're like, oh yeah, that happened to me. And I made it through it, But you never cave in the moment. Stay in faith. Anyway, but the battle's for your mind. And so they call it psychological warfare, cognitive warfare. Karl von Clausewitz was a 19th century military theorist, and he gave the classic definition of the purpose of war. The purpose of war is to force your opponent to submit to your will. You're out there killing their bodies with all kinds of weapons. Why? Because their mind is loyal to the other side. What if you could just mess with their mind? Get them to be disloyal. Get them to be in fear. Get them to be disheartened, discouraged, confused. And Sun Tzu's Art of War, 5th century BC Chinese military strategist, gives all this advice about fighting battles. And at the end he says, supreme excellence in a commander consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without a fight. So you can, always do, never fight in front of a river and always try to get the uphill and all this kind of strategy. But he says, supreme excellence, you get them to surrender without a fight. Now it's called 5th generation warfare, where you get your enemies to surrender without them even being aware they're in a war. I mean, why even wake them up if the goal is to get them to submit to your will? You just get them to submit to your will without them even waking up to realize they're in a war. And so this battle for the mind, psychological operations, short for PsyOps, we did it during World War II, dropping pamphlets on German towns saying, your side has already lost, your commander just hasn't told you. And so the people would be like doubting their commander. I read that we already lost. Why are we out there? I don't know if I should want to die if we're already lost. And it would mess with their mind. And the Japanese did it to us with Tokyo Rose. Had a seductive voice, and she's on the radio, and it just goes across the Pacific waves, and you Americans are terrible, and you're doing all this terrible stuff. And it would mess with our guys' minds. And fear spreads like fire, but courage is contagious. Perfect love casts out fear. When you really dwell on how much God loves you, he made you, trust him, then you don't have to walk in fear. It's like, God's going to take care of me, So let's see it in reverse. Gideon. There's 100,000 Midianites. He gets 30,000 Israelites, and God tells him, too many. Tell everyone that's scared to go home. So they leave. Now it's down to 10,000. And God said, still too many. Go drink from a creek. And then he took the 300 that brought the water to their mouth, and he goes, okay, with these 300, I can defeat 100,000 Midianites. And so God rolls up his sleeves, and he says, watch this. And he has them take their torches with the clay pot and the trumpets, and they surround the army, and then they smash the clay pots, and the torches are there, and then they blow the trumpets, and these, in the complete pitch black dark of the night, the enemy rises up out of their tents, and they're bumping into each other, and they're killing each other, right? But they were defeated in their mind. So just like the 10 spies defeated the Israelites in their mind, Gideon defeated the enemy in their mind. And so the battle for the mind started with marketing of products. 1800s, you had Sears catalog, Wells Fargo wagon, and they would list every possible detail about a Singer sewing machine. And you would make an informed purchase. But in the early 1900s, you had magazine ads. And people would buy something without knowing anything about the product. because they saw it in the magazines and it looked like everybody was using it. And the classic is Crisco. Nobody knew what Crisco was made out of. They even made up a term called vegetable-based. And, but everybody bought it, and we've eaten it. You know what Crisco's made out of? Cottonseed oil. In the Deep South, they would harvest cotton, and they would have these mountains of black seeds that nobody wanted, and they would mush it together into this black, mucky industrial oil that they would use in factories and machinery. Nobody ate that stuff. But somebody had the idea of bleaching it, put it in this nice containers with an ad campaign, made it look like everybody was using it, and we've all eaten it. And so you go from knowing everything about a product to knowing nothing about a product, but you buy it because it looks like everybody's using it. And they even made a cartoon in New York called Keeping Up with the Joneses. Everybody's wanting products because they see other people. They don't know anything about the product. And here's tobacco. They thought it was throat protection. I mean, they know nothing about a product, but they buy it because it looks like. And so the person that pioneered this was Edward Bernays, and he's considered the father of propaganda. And even the engineering of female consent. It's like, what in the world is that? And so he writes a book called Propaganda in 1928. He's a nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he talks about women buying shoes. And he says, women go into a department store and buy shoes. And they think they're picking out the shoes, but they're not. The shoes were picked out for them by the marketing executive that paid the actress to put them on, that paid the photographer to take the pictures, that paid to put them in the magazines, and they see it in the magazines and they want it. He says, a large manufacturer of women's shoes has a popular actress. Wear the shoes, the fashion spreads. The man who injected this idea into the shoe industry was ruling women in one department of their social lives. Today, a minority has discovered a powerful help in influencing the majority to mold the minds of the masses. They find in propaganda a tool which is increasingly powerful, regimenting the public mind. And so he changed the name of propaganda to public relations. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics, business, or in social conduct or ethical thinking, we are dominated by a relatively small number of persons. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. And so we are a government from the consent of the governed. It's in our declaration. But what if you could engineer consent? So he writes a book called The Engineering of Consent. He says manipulation of the opinion of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of the country. So, hey, we all get to give our consent, we get to vote, but you only vote for what you know about, and who tells you what you know about is the sources of your information. And then he writes another book, The Crystallizing of Public Opinion. And then somebody named Noam Chomsky writes a book called Manufacturing Consent. And Oswald Spengler, a historian in 1923, democracy has become a weapon of the moneyed interests. It uses the media to create the illusion that there is consent of the governed. The press today is an army of carefully organized weapons, its journalists, the officers, its readers, its soldiers. The reader neither knows nor is supposed to know the purposes for which he is used and the role he is to play. Democracy is often a government of wealthy elites. And so you vote for what you know about, but all you know about is what the people that control the newspapers and the radio and the TV and now the internet, what they tell you. And the newspapers began to realize how much power they had during the Spanish-American War. And so you had Cuba, and the Spanish were trying to put down a rebellion. They send over a governor named Weiler, and he put people in concentration camps, and they were starving to death. And America was busy being America, and we didn't care what was happening 90 miles off the coast. And so William Randolph Hearst, with his New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer Prize, with his New York World, their newspapers, they began to publish articles saying that we need to get involved to free Cuba from Spain. It's called yellow press journalism because they printed on cheap paper that would turn yellow after a few days. And Hearst sent illustrator Frederick Remington to Cuba. They couldn't print photographs in the newspaper yet. It was etchings. And so they needed an artist, an illustrator to do this. And he draws pictures of these starving people. And Hearst Cable's Remington says, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. Right? And so the press realized that they could stir the country up to action. And now, democracy. Demos means people, democracy means rule. And in the democracy, you have citizens, and the word citizen means co-ruler. And so in Athens, they had 6,000 citizens. And if there's a king and you have an agenda, you got to get in to see the king. Like China would have an emperor with 2,000 concubines and the Mandarin eunuchs that would keep the harem. And if you wanted to get in to see the emperor because you had an agenda, you had to bribe these mandarins with money or something to get them to arrange a meeting with you and the emperor. But in Athens, they had no emperor. And if you have an agenda, how do you pitch your agenda to the entire city of 6,000 people? That's when they invented theater. And they would get the whole city together in a theater, and they would put on plays, comedies, tragedies, satires, where they would ridicule and buffoon certain points of view and honor and extol other points of view. There's the comedies of Aristophanes, and they would make fun of current politicians by name, very similar to Saturday Night Live. They would ridicule them and mock them, and everybody would laugh, and then they would sort of feel sorry for them, and then they would leave the theater thinking, I don't want to be like that poor guy. And you would back away from them and everything they stood for. And then they would have these tragedies where they would make these noble people with, courage, and you would leave the theater saying, man, I want to be remembered like that guy. And you would find your behavior being manipulated based on this. So from that time till now, theater is always political in a country where the people are the king. So media, Hollywood, theater, anything. And so think of your favorite sitcom or movie, and there's a character you identify with. They're cute, they're funny, they're the hero. And the first couple episodes, they're a good, upstanding, moral person, but then they begin to have the show have your favorite character begin to make morally compromising decisions. They get put in situations and they begin to justify doing that and the other, and you find yourself apologizing for them, saying, I know James Bond is with a woman he's not married to, but he's about to save the world. So can we get on with the story? And it minimizes something that used to be important to you, marital fidelity. And then they make people that hold old traditional values look like they're backwards and bumpkins and simpletons and even hateful if and you're not going along with the new whatever sexual agenda. And you find yourself turning off the show and saying, yeah, that person was a stodgy old person, and I don't want to be perceived like that. And so this other person, they were so cool, I want to wear their perfume and their tennis shoes, And so from that time till now, theater's political. One of the interesting things of theater was the presidential debates between Nixon and Kennedy, first presidential debates ever televised. Kennedy put on makeup, Nixon didn't. Everybody that heard the debate on radio said Nixon won hands down. Everybody that watched it on TV, particularly the women, said Kennedy won hands down. Because he didn't wear makeup and the bright studio lights made it look like he had bags under his eyes and he looked like an old hag type guy. And Will and Ariel Durant, historians, democracy is the most difficult of all forms of government since it requires the widest spread of intelligence. Ignorance lends itself to manipulation by the forces that mold public opinion. Another guy, Llewellyn Rockwell, writes, democracy has turned out to be not majority rule, but rule by the well-organized and well-connected minority groups who steal from the majority. This is in the Bible. So a minority are the Pharisees. The people, they praised Jesus when he was coming into Jerusalem a week earlier. But here's Pilate answered them saying, will ye that I release unto you the king of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. But the chief priests moved the people that he should rather release Barabbas. Pilate answered, what will ye then that I shall do unto him who's called king of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. So Pilate, willing to content the people, delivered Jesus to be crucified. So let's take this apart. You have Pilate did what the majority of the people wanted, but the people did what the minority of the chief priests wanted. You have a minority manipulating the public opinion of the majority, and they got Jesus crucified. So if you think of it as a domino effect, the country's controlled by laws, laws are controlled by politicians, politicians are controlled by voters, voters are controlled by public opinion. You don't know what to vote for other than what you're told, right? Public opinion is controlled by media in the short run, education in the long run, church. Historically, the church had a really big role in molding public opinion, and then the internet, because everybody's using the internet nowadays. So whoever controls the internet and the media, education, and the church, whether they're teaching the Bible or whether they're woke, they form the public opinion, which influences the voters, which influences the elections, which influences the politicians and the laws and the country. And there's a saying, politics is downstream from culture, right? So you had the socialists in Russia having an argument where some wanted to conquer the world with tanks and others wanted to take a slow route. And the guy that wanted to take the slow route is Antonio Gramsci, and he is arrested and put in Italian prison where he dies, but he writes his prison notebooks, and he says, you can't defeat the West with tanks. You gotta take the long march through the institutions. And so he says, the civilized world has been thoroughly saturated with Christianity for 2,000 years. Any country grounded in Judeo-Christian values cannot be overthrown until those roots are cut. Judeo-Christian values influences the individual. You have rights as an individual. And you have to get rid of you thinking about that. You have to identify with the group, the socialist group. Socialism is precisely the religion which must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media, transforming the consciousness of society. So it's an infiltration. It's a slow route of rotting the country from the inside. And so we heard, the 7 mountains of influence. Lance Wallnau talks about that. Let's try to get Christians involved in the arts and entertainment, and then Christians involved in business and education and family and government, media and religion, right? Well, we had all those. Those all belonged, the Christians were involved in all those. And we got into just abandoning our responsibility, and they usurped control. They infiltrated, like Antonio Gramsci said, and now we're trying to regain what we had before. And so while they're infiltrating, you have a Congressman, Albert Herlong in Florida, and he lists in the congressional record their tactics. Capture one or both political parties. Get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and communist propaganda. Get control of Teachers Association. Put party line in textbooks. Infiltrate the press. Gain control of key positions in radio, TV. Infiltrate the churches. Replace revealed religion with social religion. Social justice. This is 1963. He said this is what they're going to try to do. They're going to try to change the gospel from we're sinners, we're going to hell, Jesus died on the cross to pay for our sins. They want to change it to, we got to demonstrate and we got to tear things down so that we can, do whatever our agenda is. Infiltrate and gain control of more unions. Infiltrate, gain control of big business. And they do something called deconstruction. I talked about that. And it's interesting, even China did deconstruction. So you had 3rd century BC is called the Warring States period. And you have 6 kingdoms fighting, and one wins, led by Qin Shi Huangdi. And he's the unifier of China, and he is being criticized because he's doing things differently than they had been done for centuries before. And he got tired of being criticized, and so he decided to destroy all records of how things were done before. And he destroyed tens of thousands of bamboo annal books. They wrote on strips of bamboo from top to bottom, and he ordered them burned. And he said, Chancellor Li Si writes, I, your servant, propose that all historians' records other than Quinn's be burned. If anyone under heaven has copies of the classics of history, they shall deliver them to the governor for burning. Anyone who dares discuss the classics of history shall be publicly executed. Anyone who uses history to criticize the present shall have his family executed. Anyone who has failed to burn the books after 30 days of this announcement shall be sent to build a great wall. And so you wanted to not just spin current news, you want to spin past news. Change the history. And So Mao Zedong did a similar thing in the 1960s called the Cultural Revolution. He destroyed 5,000 years of Chinese history. And they would do public shamings. If you were educated as a doctor or a lawyer or anybody with Western concepts, they would bring you in and force you to confess your whiteness, that you're part of the evil Western capitalist West, and they would, cut them and they would bleed, and the more blood these kids got on their clothes, the more they were the Antifa radicals, and they were like really proud of themselves, and then they burnt the oldest Buddhist temple in China, and then the great gates of Beijing, they burned it all, Anyway, Pol Pot did a similar thing in Cambodia. He made 1975 the New Year Zero and said anything prior to that was irrelevant. And he killed anybody that wore glasses. He said if you wore glasses, you could read. If you read, you knew the history. He wanted to destroy the history because he wanted to do something new. Islam does it. Whenever they would come into a country, they would destroy the history, like the Greek temples and everything. And now it's called the 1619 Project. They want to rewrite history. Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, it rewrites history, makes all the good people into the bad people. America's bad, bad, bad. These kids read it. America's bad, bad. We don't want America anymore. We want to do what other countries are doing. And Carl Sandburg, a poet, said, when a nation goes down, one condition may always be found: they forgot where they came from. And then George Orwell writes 1984, and he writes it in 1948. And he has a character named Winston, whose job is the Ministry of Truth, but all it does is lie, right? It's the government lying to the people. And the pneumatic tube was a new invention, like you go to a bank and put your deposit in and it sucks it through. And so he sat at his desk, and down one pneumatic tube would come the history that he's supposed to edit. And he would cut out the old history, put it in another pneumatic tube, and send it down memory hole into the incinerator in the basement. And it would be burnt and erased forever, and he would put in the new history. And he's just constantly rewriting history every day. And he said, every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is right. I know, of course, that the past is falsified, but it would never be possible for me to prove it, even when I did the falsification myself. After the thing is done, no evidence remains. The only evidence is inside my own mind. And I don't know that any other human being shares my memories. Everything faded into mist. The past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the lie became truth. If there's no God, there's no right and wrong. If you can spin a story to achieve your agenda, you can spin history to achieve your agenda. And anyway, so we're talking about marketing and using the marketing tactics to push an ideology. And you make it look like everybody's going along with a product. You make it look like everybody's going along with an ideology. This is a way that you motivate a population to move towards socialism. And then another important ingredient is fear. We talked about how in times of fear, people panic and trade freedom for security. Well, they began to study how fear is electric. In a 1938 radio drama, War of the Worlds, Orson Welles we interrupt this program to announce that New Jersey is being invaded by Martians. Everybody in the country panics. I mean, they run outside, look up in the sky. It was a phenomenon that was studied. How can you get an entire nation to do something instantly? Fear. And then they began to have these movies called Gaslight, but they were psychological dramas. And this one, Ingrid Bergman, daughter of a famous actress in the movie, and the actress had expensive jewels given to her, and she dies, and Ingrid inherits the house. And some guy knows the jewels are there, so he begins to be friends with her, and then courts her, and then marries her. And then he would say, I'm going to go for a walk and smoke my pipe. And so he would leave, but he would go down the street, up the fire escape. It's in London, and he'd crawl across the roofs, go in the window, and he'd turn the lamp on in the attic to look for the jewels and all the stuff that the actress had left, but she had locked the door so you couldn't get up there because it was too emotional for her. Anyway, whenever he would turn the lamp on in the attic, it would get dim in her bedroom. And she would tell him, whenever you go for your walk, the light in my bedroom gets dimmer. And he goes, you're seeing things. Your eyes are playing tricks on you. I think the stress is getting to you. I think we need to take you to a doctor. I think we need to sign you into an insane asylum. I mean, and she's about to sign herself in when the hero across the street saw the light go dimmer in her room and go on in the attic, and he finds out, and they break the news and they drag the guy away. But it was a phenomenon that went into our dictionary. It's called gaslighting. And psychology today, victims of gaslighting are systematically fed false information that leads them to question what they know to be true. They end up doubting their memory, their perception, even their sanity. And so you do this on a national level through all the national media, and you feed the country lies so that they begin to think, hey, I don't know if I know what I know anymore. I don't know what's right or wrong. It's only when you can stick with the scripture can you see through all this nonsense. And but then we have the military. During the World War II, the Army and Navy Air Force Motion Picture Service. Now, why in the world would they want to make money? They realize the power of this. And so the same guy did it in Germany. Edward Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels. He actually read Edward Bernays' works. And he realized fear motivates people, so we have the fear of the war. And everybody does what they see everybody else doing. So he orchestrates a Colosseum event with 100,000 people, and they begin to give the Hitler salute in the front. And like a wave at a football game, it begins to work its way back. And everybody sees everybody else giving it, and they don't want to be the one not to give it, so they give it. Then everybody sees you give it, and they give it. And it manipulate. I mean, how do you get an entire nation to go along with this Nazi stuff? Fear, and you make it look like everybody's doing it. And they call it fear-mongering. And Joseph Goebbels. It's the absolute right of the state to supervise the formation of public opinion. Think of the press as a great keyboard on which the government can play. I love this quote from Lord Acton in England. He says, official truth is not actual truth. Whenever the government says, okay, this is official truth, you can guarantee that it's probably not what really happened. Here's Kissinger. It's not a matter of what is true that counts, but a matter of what is perceived to be true. And then they do something called blame shifting, where George Orwell used the term doublespeak. And did I talk about this? David Axelrod was Obama's campaign advisor, and he says, in Chicago, there's an old tradition of throwing a brick through your own campaign office window, calling a press conference to say you've been attacked. So you do the bad stuff, and you blame your opponent for the bad stuff. So you have a candidate, maybe she's colluding with Russia, giving away a fifth of the U.S. uranium when she's Secretary of State in exchange for a $145 million contribution to her Clinton Foundation, clearly colluding with Russia. What does she do? She pays for a Steele dossier to accuse her opponent of colluding with Russia. And he has to go through years of trials and impeachment. And when it comes back to the fact that she paid for it all, she just pays a $113,000 fine to the FEC, and she's off the hook. All right, so you lie about your opponent, and then you have another candidate that's extorting Ukraine. And he says, I told them to stop investigating my son, or I would fire them, and I'd hold back millions of dollars of U.S. aid. What do? They accuse his opponent, Trump, of extorting Ukraine. All right, so they accuse you of what they're guilty of, and they do it every single day. And Rand Paul is grilling the Homeland Security guy, Mayorkas, on a disinformation governance board. And Rand Paul says, do you know the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world? The U.S. government. Now, this all, to put it in social, it's a manipulation of the human desire to fit in with a group and the human fear of being rejected from a group. So a water molecule is individual, but you put it with other water molecules, and they operate as a group in waves. A fish in a bowl, but you put it with other fish, they operate in a group. An individual bird in a cage, but you put it with other birds, they operate in a group. And so you have us as individuals, but you put us together with other individuals, and we're constantly giving and receiving input as to whether or not we're being accepted or rejected. We're operating in a group, and we see people doing stuff, and we feel pressure to do it, and we don't want to be left out. And so now at the beginning of America, the majority of the people were Christian. And so you had some people operating and behaving as Christians because they wanted to fit in with this Christian society, and that was, in a sense, a good thing. But then they've taken over the media, and now they are pushing what's acceptable and what's not, and this fear of rejection. And Alinsky said, ridicule is man's most powerful weapon. Nobody wants to be not chosen to play the ball game or not invited to the party. And so brainwashing, that term came into use in the 1950s, and it came out of the Buddhist concept of washing or cleansing the mind. You know how they would meditate and blank out their mind, right? And then wash. And so it's an emotional reset. During the Korean War, these guys went into the military loving America. They got captured. We rescued them. And they hated America. It's like, what happened to them? Well, they would put them in a room and isolate them for weeks and months until they craved wanting to get back to normal, wanting to have a relationship, wanting to have the buddy pat on the back, you know. And when they were at this vulnerable, fragile, psychological state, they would bring them into a room with a bunch of guys who had already caved. And before they could be accepted in the group and get their pat on the back and their buddy, they had to reject America, confess their whiteness, that America was an evil Western capitalist system, that it's terrible, terrible, terrible. And once they did, they got the reinforcement emotionally. And once they emotionally identified with hating America, boom, they're stuck for life. And so there was a bunch of studying of this manipulation of, and then they found that with the prisoners, they required minute obedience till the victim stopped thinking critically or logically and just surrendered in blind compliance. So the human mind wants to know, now why am I taking off my belt and my shoes, and why am I wearing this mask again? Why am I? And it's like every time you go through the airport, they switch it up. Like, okay, now you can put this in, now you don't have to, right? And then it changes. And so the human mind says, okay, why am I taking these rocks over here? You know, it's like I'm going to build something the next day, they make you take the rocks back where it came from. Until finally you're like, you stop trying to figure out why you're doing something. You're just like, I'm a zombie, tell me what you want me to do. Okay, do this. Okay, fine. Okay, do this, right? And so that part of the brainwashing is to get people to obey minute things that make no sense until they finally just say, okay, I'm not going to try to figure out why I'm doing it. I'm just going to obey. And then successful resistance to this were people that had a sense of humor. I thought that was interesting when they were studying the psychology of. So they did something called the Ash Conformity Experiment in the 1960s and 70s, trying to figure out how they got a whole nation of people to kill the Jews. And so this is called the Ash Conformity Experiment, and they did it on college campuses. They would pull 8 students into a room. 7 had been paid ahead of time to be actors. 1 was a naive participant, and the teacher put 2 cards on the front desk. 1 card had 1 line, the other 3 lines. And they would begin with the paid actors and go around the room, and they would convincingly say that the shorter line was equal to the first line. By the time it got around to the 8th naive participant, 30% of them would deny their own eyes to fit in with the group. They would doubt their perceptions, like they see something I don't see, right? And so now if only 1 objected, it went from 30% down to 5%. And then they called the spiral of silence. People self-censor their own views if they think they're in the minority. And so they want to give you the perception you're in the minority, so you'll censor yourself. And then Chuck Colson told a story about a wine tasting. Everybody's in on it except 1 couple. They pour vinegar in the wine. This couple writes, this tastes terrible. But one by one, the other couples would say, this was great, this robust, character, delicious, all this. By the time it got around to this couple, they scratched out what they wrote. They said, yeah, it tasted good. And then when somebody said all they did was pour vinegar in, the couple that changed their views criticized the person for saying they poured vinegar in. And it's a phenomenon called false enforcement. Once somebody buys into the lie, they will want to enforce that other people buy into the lie. All right? So, and then they had another experiment that this one was sort of macabre, but they said, well, were the people in Germany evil when they were killing the Jews? And then they realized they did an experiment in 1963 at Yale. Stanley Milgram shock experiment. So Milgram placed ads in the newspaper for volunteers to be teachers and learners. The learners were in on the experiment. And so the teachers watched the learners being attached to wires, and then the teachers were placed in a separate room within earshot of the learners, and the teachers were had a microphone, and they were going to ask the learner questions. And whenever the learner got a question wrong, the teacher was supposed to flip a switch on this electric-looking box to give the learner a shock. Now, the learner really was not getting the shock, but the teacher didn't know that. And so he would ask him a question, and they would get it wrong, and he'd switch it, and the person would say, ow. And then he'd ask him another question, and they'd get it wrong, and he'd go, ow. And he gets another one, and go, ah. And then finally, the person's like screaming at the top of their lungs. And then finally, he's asking questions, and the person's not responding. And he turns to this professor-looking guy next to him in the white jacket and says, you want to check on that guy, see if he's okay? No, it's science. You must continue. And he's like, well, are you sure? It's like, it's science. You must continue. And the guy's like, well, okay. And he asks him another question. There's no response. And he kicks it. He goes, are you sure the guy's not dead or having a heart attack? Are you sure you want to? No, it's science. It must continue. They found out that they would give shocks of like 450 volts, enough to kill somebody, as long as there's somebody saying, it is science. It must continue. Right? And anyway. So during the Cold War, you would have these new countries in Europe after World War II, and they would elect new leaders, and they would try to piece together their lives, and the communists didn't like that. And so they would send KGB people into these countries to do critical theory, break them into groups, pit them against each other, co-opt the media to bribe the new leader for all the problems. And when the country got stirred up enough, they would do a coup and put the leader under house arrest, and then switch it out with the Soviet puppet. But they would get control of the media. And so then the CIA begins to copy that. And so Carl Bernstein writes in Rolling Stone magazine, he's the Watergate reporter, in 1977, an article called The CIA in the Press. And he says the CIA has 700 plants in NBC, CBS, and they're writing the stories, and they're telling you what the government wants you to hear. And it's called Operation Mockingbird. And anyway. And so now it's done online with Facebook and Twitter. But, this is prior to Elon, but they're acknowledging that they were swaying voters. And Biden bring the TikTok stars in there to get them to influence people on the Russia invasion. It's like they don't know anything about the Russian invasion. Anyway. So lots more, but let me get here to the something that's sort of spiritual. So people want to be accepted in a group. They don't want to be rejected from the group. It's very powerful. It's in the Bible. Peter was with Jesus 3 years. He looks Jesus in the eye and says, I will never deny you. A couple hours later, Peter is around a fire, and a girl gets in his face and says, you were with Jesus? And you can just picture Peter looking around the fire, and everybody's eyeing him. And he says, I never met the guy. Like, that's it, Peter? You caved so fast? The power of being rejected from a group is very powerful. But after the resurrection, Peter's filled with the Holy Spirit. The Sanhedrin says, we told you never to speak in his name again. And Peter says, it's better to obey God rather than men. Suddenly, Peter doesn't care what the group says. He only cares what God says. It's only when you have a relationship with God can you not care about being accepted or rejected by men. And God told Jeremiah, be not afraid of their faces, for I am with thee to deliver thee. I saw this one, Exodus 23:2. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Everybody's doing it. Everybody's doing it. I feel this pressure with this group to do it. And it says, thou shalt not follow the multitude to do evil. God wants you to stand up and stand out. And Sam Coonrod, Giants baseball pitcher, only one not to kneel in protest to the flag. They asked him afterwards why. He says, I'm a Christian, so I just believe that I can't kneel before anything besides God. It's only when you have a relationship with God can you not care about what men and women and others think about you. Orlando Magic forward Jonathan Isaac, only player not to stand and kneel in protest. They asked him afterwards. He says, all lives are supported through the gospel. Everyone's made in the image of God, and we all share in his glory. The early believers prayed, Lord, look upon their threats and grant us boldness. Let this mind be in you, which is also in Christ Jesus, who made himself of no reputation. We have to not be, people say, oh, give your life for Jesus. That's easy to do. But part of giving your life for Jesus is, are you willing to let people lie about you and spread rumors about you that are wrong? But you're willing to stand up for Jesus, right? And when you run for office and they're printing lies about you in the newspaper, and I know a little bit about that because I ran for Congress against Dick Gebhardt. He was the House minority. He was the Nancy Pelosi before Nancy Pelosi. He spent $9 million trying to destroy me, running all kinds of ads, right? One of them, I mean, the one book I wrote, America's God and Country, it sold 500,000 copies. I had, libraries buying copies. I even had the Army buy them, put them in their PXs. I mean, I had James Dobson selling the book. I mean, it's just a book of quotes. They found some website of the Montana militia, and they had like 100 books, and my book was one of them. So they ran these ads that Bill Federer supplies books to the Montana militia. Bill Federer, too extreme for Missouri. And they ran that every day for like 3 months, 5 times a day on every TV and radio station in St. Louis. And to show you about it, like 2 years later, after the race, my brother has me speak to his school for his son, and I wrote a book on George Washington Carver. And so I'm talking to these little kids. The kids' feet don't even hit the floor on the desk. I mean, they're little kids. And they introduced me, and they said, this is Bill Federer. And the one little kid raises his hand. He goes, I remember you, Bill Federer, too extreme for Missouri. I mean, they hammered that. And But Mr. Gebhardt is no longer in the public eye, and I'm still ticking, right? And so, but you have to be willing to make yourself, have to let people lie about you to stand up for Jesus. Let them lie about him. And so, do you care about approval by man or approval by God? And again, in ending, we're the bride of Christ. And every romance novel builds up to a decision-making moment, a forsaking of all others and choosing the one. And I believe God is pushing the world to a decision-making moment. That when a cell divides, some stuff goes to the right and some stuff goes to the left, and there's nothing left in the middle. And so you have some people that are doing evil. There are some people that are silent in the face of evil, and by their silence they're giving consent to evil. And they're choosing their sides, and there's not going to be any evil in heaven, right? I thought this was interesting. We're all familiar with the line, love your neighbor as yourself. It's in the Old Testament. It's Leviticus 19:18. Do you know the verse immediately before that? Leviticus 19:17. It says, rebuke your neighbor directly so you will not be held guilty for their sin. Right? Rebuke them. It's like they're doing something wrong, you got to rebuke them. So if there are sins and you see it happening, God wants you to stand up and call them out. And if you're silent and not calling them up, you will be guilty for their sin. So they're doing the sinning, and if you're silent in the face of sin, you're guilty for the sin. And then the next line says, love your neighbor as yourself, but you're rebuking them all the time. It's a self-policing system in ancient Israel. So there's some that are going to do evil, and some that are going to be silent in the face of evil, and by their silence they're giving consent, they're choosing sides, and they're going that way. And there's other people that saying, you know what, I stretched the rubber band and tolerated something I didn't feel good about, but I did it anyway because I felt pressure from people. And then I tolerated something else. I didn't feel good about it, but I felt the pressure from people to do it. But I'm sorry, I can't go with this trans agenda and mutilating little 12-year-old girls and chemically castrating little boys. And California had a bill to kill a baby 28 days old, and Satan-worshiping Grammys, and Disney wanting to do a cartoon on that. I'm sorry, I just can't go there. And you cut the rubber band, and you say, since I don't care what people think about me anymore, I'm going to be more excited about Jesus than ever before. And you got this split, this division going on, and this one's going to be the bride of Christ. And I feel God pushing the world to this decision-making moment. And it's exciting. I mean, anyway, it's one of those things where my files just keeps going on. But when we see it from God's perspective, and every generation has a crisis. Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, bubonic plague, Spanish flu. Every generation has a crisis. The crisis of the generation is an opportunity for the people that are alive to respond. And some people do something and some other people do nothing. And historically, the Christians have always ran to the crises to be the answer. I was speaking up in, Pennsylvania somewhere, and it was like a Mennonite type community. And when I guess for whatever thing I do, I get a chance to speak in all kinds of different denominations. And so the ladies had sort of the blue and white type checkered dresses and with the little buns on their hair. And I'm thinking, oh, these are sort of simple Christians. And the girl says, yeah, we're getting ready to go over to Syria to minister to the refugees. And I'm like, there's like ISIS killing people in Syria? She goes, yeah, we know, but we're going to go over there and minister. And they told us that we might die, and they showed us a video of ISIS coming into a town, and they had this Christian guy, and they had him kneeling with their sword, and they said, deny Jesus or we'll chop your head off. The guy denies Jesus, they chop his head off anyway and chuckle. And she says, they show us this because we have to make the decision that if we go over there, that we're not going to deny Christ, even if they chop our head off. I'm like, whoa, these are like serious Christians. They're like putting me to shame, right? But historically, that was the Christian response. Whenever there was a need, it's like, okay, God, where do you need me? Thy will, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. It's like, okay, I'm yours. I'm dead. My life is hid with Christ and God. Where do you need me? Instead of, oh, don't, stay away from me. I don't want to get anything, And so every crisis is sort of a mini self-sorting out of the sheep and the goats. It's not the ultimate one. When, Lord, were you naked and we clothed you? But on a small level, every generation has a crisis. And some respond by rushing forward and saying, okay, where do you need me? And others run by running away and hiding. And I thought of freshman chemistry class, you have a beaker with a solution. And the teacher pours in a catalyst that causes a reaction. And some stuff precipitates and settles to the bottom of the beaker, and other stuff gets effervescent and bubbly and floats to the top. The time period we're living in is the solution in the beaker. The crisis of our time period is the catalyst that's poured in, and there's a reaction. Some people precipitate and drop out and run away and hide, and they say, oh, I just got to keep my job, and I'll take the mark of the beast. And other people say, they get more effervescent. They're like, okay, Lord, where do you need me? The early church, when they were persecuted, they prayed for boldness. And it's the same crisis, but there's two different responses. And so I think that, yes, we want to turn the world around, and we want to turn the country around, but my attitude is, whether we do or not, the Lord wants to see us jump in and be the arms and feet and try to do something. And and I'll wind it up. So you have, God knew what was in Abraham's heart, but he wanted to see Abraham be willing to take his son Isaac to the top of Mount Moriah and be willing to kill him. People say, God knows my heart. He goes, okay. A guy's watching football and you come and you say, hey, when was the last time you told your wife you love her? And it's like, oh, I can't remember, but she knows my heart. It's like, okay. When was the last time you did anything to tell your wife, to show your wife you love her? Oh, I can't remember, but she knows my heart. It's like, dude, we need to have a little talk. Yeah. It's like, God knows my heart. Yes, he does know your heart, and he wants to hear some words out of your mouth, and he wants to see some actions. Right? He put you in the physical world, and he wants you to manifest what's the love of God that's in your heart outside of your heart, in the physical world. He wants to see you do something. Right? And so the crisis of the era is the opportunity for us to do something for him. And it's exciting. There's nothing more fulfilling than letting the Lord use you. And to see God change lives through you. And I'll end with that. God bless you. Thank you for letting me be with you.